September 15, 1940. 2:45 in the afternoon. The autumn sun slants through the windows of RAF Bentley Priory, casting long shadows across maps that show the fate of civilization hanging in the balance. Air Chief Marshal Hugh Doding stands before a plotting table where colored counters represent not just aircraft, but the dreams and fears of 8 million Londoners who have no idea that the next 6 hours will determine whether their city survives the night. Across the English Channel, in a concrete bunker beneath the French countryside, General Major Wolfgang Martini holds a piece of paper that will change everything. It's a weather report, routine, technical, filled with the kind of meteorological data that most people ignore. But Martini isn't most people. He's the Luftwaffe's chief signals officer, and the paper in his hands contains information that has traveled from an American weather station in Newfoundland, through British intercept stations, past German cryptographers, and finally to his desk, where it will help plan the largest aerial assault in human history. The paper says the weather will be perfect for bombing London tonight. The paper is wrong. Lieutenant Colonel James Fleming sits in a Quonset hut in Gander, Newfoundland, surrounded by instruments that measure wind speed, barometric pressure, humidity levels, and a dozen other atmospheric variables that determine whether men live or die 3,000 miles away. He's been tracking a weather system moving across the Atlantic, watching it grow and shift and transform as it travels toward Europe. His job is to predict where this system will be in 18 hours, how it will affect visibility, wind patterns, cloud cover, all the factors that determine whether bombers can find their targets and fighters can find the bombers. Fleming has been doing this job for 8 months, ever since the Royal Air Force began sharing weather intelligence with American stations. His reports help British meteorologists compile the comprehensive forecasts that Fighter Command uses to position aircraft, schedule patrols, and prepare for the daily air battles that will determine whether Britain survives as a free nation. But today, Fleming makes a mistake. A small mistake. The kind that happens when exhausted men work 18-hour shifts, tracking weather systems that move faster than human calculations can follow. He misreads the pressure gradient by 3 millibars. He miscalculates the storm's forward speed by 12 knots. He predicts clear skies over southeastern England, when there will actually be heavy cloud cover, poor visibility, and crosswinds that will make precision bombing nearly impossible. Fleming's mistake travels through the intelligence network like a virus, spreading from station to station, report to report, decision to decision. It reaches British meteorological headquarters, where it's integrated into forecasts that predict favorable bombing conditions for German aircraft. It's intercepted by German listening posts, decoded by German intelligence, and passed to German commanders who are planning the most devastating air raid in history. General Major Martini studies Fleming's erroneous forecast and sees opportunity. The weather will be perfect, visibility unlimited, winds favorable, cloud cover minimal. Conditions that will allow German bombers to fly in tight formation, navigate with precision, and deliver their payloads with devastating accuracy. Tonight, the Luftwaffe will destroy London. Except the weather won't be perfect. The visibility will be terrible. The winds will be chaotic. The clouds will be so thick that pilots won't be able to see their own wingtips, much less their targets below. Fleming's mistake will save a city. But in the concrete bunker beneath France, Martini doesn't know that he's reading fiction disguised as meteorology. He sees clear skies and makes the decision that will launch 1,485 aircraft toward London in the largest daylight bombing raid ever attempted. He sees perfect conditions and orders the attack that will either break British resistance or shatter German air power forever. 3 hours later, As the first German formations cross the Channel coast, the pilots see something that doesn't match their briefings. They see clouds, thick, towering cumulus formations that rise like gray mountains from the earth to 30,000 feet. They see wind that tosses their aircraft like toys, that breaks up their carefully planned formations, that makes navigation a matter of guesswork rather than precision. They see weather that Fleming predicted would be perfect, but which is actually perfectly terrible for everything they're trying to accomplish. Hauptmann Klaus Mitusch leads the first wave of Heinkel bombers toward what should be the clear skies over London. Instead, he's flying blind through clouds so thick that he can't see the aircraft flying 50 meters beside him. His navigator, a young man named Weber, who learned his trade flying mail routes over the Alps, keeps checking his instruments and shaking his head in confusion. "The weather report," Weber shouts over the engine noise, "said clear skies and unlimited visibility." Mitusch stares into gray nothingness and wonders if they're flying toward London or toward the Atlantic Ocean or toward some alternate universe where meteorology has different rules. The compass spins uncertainly. The radio crackles with confused voices speaking German, English, and what might be static pretending to be human communication. Behind them, following at intervals measured in seconds rather than minutes, 900 more aircraft struggle through the same impossible weather. Formations that took weeks to plan and hours to organize scatter like leaves in a windstorm. Bombers lose their fighter escorts. Fighters lose their bombers. Everyone loses their way in clouds that weren't supposed to exist. In war, information is power. The side with better intelligence wins battles, campaigns, entire conflicts. Weather forecasting had become one of the most critical intelligence operations of the Second World War, because aircraft depend on atmospheric conditions the way ships depend on ocean currents. A commander who knows the weather can position his forces advantageously, timing attacks to exploit favorable conditions and avoid dangerous ones. But sometimes, wrong information becomes salvation. Sometimes, the mistake that should cause disaster, instead, prevents catastrophe. Sometimes, being wrong about the weather is the difference between survival and annihilation. The Battle of Britain had been raging for 2 months when Fleming made his meteorological error. German aircraft had been attacking British airfields, aircraft factories, radar stations, and ports in a systematic campaign designed to destroy the Royal Air Force and prepare for Operation Sea Lion, the planned invasion of Britain. By September 15th, British fighter strength was critically low. Pilot losses were mounting faster than replacement pilots could be trained. The entire defensive system was approaching the breaking point. German intelligence knew this. Luftwaffe commanders understood that one more major attack, properly coordinated and executed with overwhelming force, could shatter British resistance entirely. They had assembled the largest bomber formation in aviation history. Nearly 1,500 aircraft, carrying enough explosives to level central London, destroy the British government, and break the will of a nation that had been fighting alone against Nazi Germany for over a year. The plan was simple in its devastating scope. Wave after wave of bombers would attack London in broad daylight, protected by the largest fighter escort ever assembled. They would target government buildings, military headquarters, communication centers, and civilian areas with equal intensity. The goal wasn't just military victory, it was psychological destruction, the complete collapse of British morale, and the end of organized resistance. Weather was crucial to the plan's success. The bombers needed clear skies for navigation and target identification. The fighters needed good visibility to protect the bomber formations and engage British interceptors. The entire operation depended on atmospheric conditions that would allow nearly 1,500 aircraft to operate as a coordinated force, rather than a confused mob. Fleming's weather report promised exactly those conditions: clear skies, unlimited visibility, light winds, scattered clouds below 15,000 feet. Perfect weather for the largest air raid in human history. The actual weather was perfect for exactly the opposite. Lieutenant Colonel Fleming never knew about his mistake. He filed his report, updated his charts, and moved on to tracking the next weather system across the North Atlantic. His error was small enough to escape notice in the daily routine of meteorological observation, insignificant in the context of his overall accuracy record, invisible among the thousands of data points that weather stations generated every day. But his mistake traveled through the intelligence network like a time bomb with a delayed fuse, ticking away in weather briefings and operational planning sessions, growing more significant with each decision that was based on false information. The German Meteorological Service received Fleming's erroneous forecast and integrated it with their own observations. Their analysis showed some discrepancies. Ground stations in France reported increasing cloud cover, and reconnaissance flights noted deteriorating visibility over the channel. But Fleming's report carried weight because it came from American sources that had proven reliable in the past. The German forecasters faced a decision that would echo through history. They could trust their own observations and delay the massive air raid until conditions improved. Or they could trust Fleming's forecast and launch the attack that would either win the war or lose it in a single afternoon. They chose to trust Fleming's mistake. The decision-making process that followed was a masterpiece of military planning corrupted by false information. Luftwaffe commanders scheduled aircraft departures, plotted navigation routes, assigned targets, and coordinated fighter escorts based on weather conditions that existed only on paper. They created a plan that would work perfectly in Fleming's predicted clear skies and fall apart completely in the actual atmospheric chaos that awaited them over southeastern England. General Oberst Albert Kesselring, commanding Luftflotte II, studied the weather forecasts one final time before giving the order that would launch the attack. He saw Fleming's prediction of clear skies and made the decision to proceed with Operation Adlertag, Eagle Day, the all-out assault that would determine the fate of Britain. 3 hours later, as the first German aircraft encountered weather that bore no resemblance to Fleming's forecast, Kesselring began to understand that meteorology could be as dangerous as enemy fighters. The German formations that crossed the English Channel that afternoon represented the largest concentration of military aircraft ever assembled. Heinkel H-111 bombers loaded with high explosives and incendiary bombs. Dornier Du 273s carrying payloads designed to level city blocks. Junkers Ju-88s, equipped with the most advanced navigation equipment the Luftwaffe possessed, all protected by Messerschmitt Bf-109 fighters that had swept the skies over Poland, Norway, Belgium, Holland, and France. It should have been unstoppable. Against clear skies and unlimited visibility, the formation might have reached London intact, delivered its devastating payload, and returned to France having dealt British resistance a blow from which it could never recover. Instead, the formation encountered Fleming's meteorological fiction made manifest in the form of weather that seemed designed specifically to destroy military aviation. Hauptmann Mitusch, leading the first wave of bombers, found himself flying through clouds so thick that it seemed solid. His aircraft disappeared into gray nothingness that absorbed sound, distorted radio signals, and made navigation impossible. Behind him, the carefully planned bomber stream began to disintegrate as pilots lost visual contact with their leaders and had to rely on instruments that were never designed for formation flying in zero visibility. The fighter escorts faced an even worse situation. Their job was to protect the bombers, but they couldn't protect aircraft they couldn't see. Messerschmitt pilots found themselves alone in hostile skies, separated from their charges, burning fuel while flying search patterns that led nowhere. Within 30 minutes of crossing the English Channel, the largest air armada in history had become a scattered collection of individual aircraft, each fighting its own private battle against weather that Fleming had predicted would be perfect. Do you think the German pilots suspected they were victims of an American weather forecaster's mistake? Do you think any of them understood that their confusion was caused not by British defensive measures or superior enemy tactics, but by Lieutenant Colonel Fleming's inability to read a barometric pressure chart correctly in a Quonset hut in Newfoundland? The moral mathematics of warfare become complex when mistakes begin saving lives. Fleming's error caused the German attack to fail, which saved London from destruction, which preserved British resistance, which eventually contributed to Allied victory. But Fleming's error also caused individual German aircrew to become lost, confused, and vulnerable to attack by British fighters who could navigate in poor weather better than invaders who were expecting clear skies. Was Fleming's mistake a blessing that saved London, or a curse that doomed German pilots who were following orders based on false information? Can an error be simultaneously salvation and tragedy, depending on which side of the equation you calculate from? These are the questions that make human conflict more complex than military planning allows for. The moral contradictions that exist in the space between individual actions and historical consequences. The British pilots who encountered the scattered German formations that afternoon never knew they were fighting weather as much as they were fighting the Luftwaffe. Flight Lieutenant Douglas Bader, leading a squadron of Spitfires from RAF Duxford, found German bombers flying alone through thick cloud, separated from their escorts, vulnerable in ways that clear weather formations never would have been. It was like shooting fish in a barrel, Bader would write later. But fish that looked lost and confused, rather than threatening. I almost felt sorry for them, flying blind through weather that made formation keeping impossible. Bader shot down 3 German aircraft that afternoon, but his victories felt different from earlier engagements. These weren't the precise, coordinated formations that had been terrorizing Britain for 2 months. These were individual aircraft flown by pilots who seemed as surprised by their circumstances as the British fighters who found them. The weather that Fleming had predicted would be clear remained stubbornly cloudy throughout the afternoon. Visibility dropped to less than 500 meters in some areas. Wind gusts of up to 40 knots disrupted any attempt at precision flying. Cloud cover extended from ground level to 25,000 feet, creating a 3-dimensional maze that made navigation virtually impossible for aircraft designed to operate in visual conditions. German bombers that managed to reach the London area found targets that were invisible beneath layers of cloud. Navigation aids that worked perfectly in clear weather became useless in atmospheric conditions that distorted radio signals and made visual landmarks disappear. Bomb aimers, who had trained to hit specific buildings, found themselves dropping explosives into gray void, hoping they were somewhere near their intended targets. The results were militarily catastrophic for Germany and strategically decisive for Britain. Instead of the concentrated destruction that a coordinated attack would have achieved, German bombs fell randomly across southeastern England. Some hit military targets by accident. Others fell on farmland, forests, and empty fields. A few found their way to London, but scattered and uncoordinated rather than focused and overwhelming. More importantly, the German aircraft that should have returned to France intact and ready for follow-up attacks instead limped home damaged, low on fuel, and confused about what had gone wrong. Many didn't make it home at all. British fighters, operating from familiar airfields with excellent ground control radar, shot down 185 German aircraft that afternoon, the largest single-day loss in Luftwaffe history. The attack that was supposed to break British resistance instead broke German air power. The formations that were supposed to overwhelm British defenses were themselves overwhelmed by weather that nobody had predicted correctly. Fleming's mistake had changed the course of the war. But Fleming still didn't know about his mistake. In his Quonset hut in Newfoundland, he continued tracking weather systems across the North Atlantic, filing reports that traveled through intelligence networks to planning rooms where men made decisions about life and death based on atmospheric predictions that were sometimes wrong in ways that saved cities. The irony of meteorological warfare is that weather affects everyone equally, but information about weather can be used as a weapon. The side with better forecasting can time attacks to exploit favorable conditions and avoid dangerous ones. But when forecasting fails, when the information becomes misinformation, the weapon turns against its user. German intelligence analysts spent weeks trying to understand what had gone wrong on September 15th. They reviewed weather reports, interviewed returning aircrew, analyzed British defensive tactics, and searched for explanations for the disaster that had befallen their largest air operation. Some blamed British weather modification technology, a conspiracy theory that credited the Royal Air Force with the ability to create clouds and manipulate atmospheric conditions. Others suspected that German weather forecasting had been sabotaged by British agents. A few suggested that the entire operation had been betrayed by spies who had provided false information to German planners. None of them suspected that the problem had originated in a Quonset hut in Newfoundland, where an overworked American meteorologist had misread a pressure gradient and inadvertently saved London from obliteration. The truth was both simpler and more complex than German intelligence could imagine. Simpler because it was just human error, the kind of mistake that happens when people work with imperfect information under impossible pressure. More complex because the error had cascaded through multiple intelligence networks, been amplified by institutional assumptions, and transformed into decisions that affected the lives of millions of people. Fleming's mistake became part of a larger pattern of meteorological confusion that plagued both sides throughout the war. Weather forecasting in the 1940s was more art than science, dependent on scattered observations, limited communication networks, and human interpretation of atmospheric data that was often incomplete and sometimes contradictory. Both German and British forces made critical decisions based on weather forecasts that proved wrong. Operations were launched in impossible conditions. Attacks were cancelled during perfect weather, and tactical advantages were lost because someone, somewhere, had misread the sky. But few meteorological errors had consequences as immediate and dramatic as Fleming's mistake on September 15th. His 3 millibar pressure miscalculation had prevented the destruction of London, saved the British government from potential collapse, and preserved the base from which Allied forces would eventually launch their own invasion of Nazi-occupied Europe. The question that haunted German planners for months afterward was whether they should have trusted their own weather observations instead of relying on intelligence reports that originated with Allied sources. German meteorologists had noted increasing cloud cover and deteriorating visibility, but their observations had been overruled by Fleming's forecast, which carried the authority of international weather networks. The decision to trust external intelligence over local observation represented a fundamental shift in military thinking. For most of human history, commanders had relied on what they could see and hear and feel directly. Weather meant looking at the sky, not reading reports from thousands of miles away. But modern warfare demanded global intelligence networks, coordination across vast distances, and decisions based on information that originated far from the battlefield. Fleming's mistake illustrated both the power and the vulnerability of these new intelligence systems. Information that could travel instantly across oceans could also carry errors at the speed of light, amplifying individual mistakes into strategic disasters. The German aircrew who survived September 15th carried their experiences into the debates about weather intelligence that followed. Hauptmann Mitusch, who had led the first wave of bombers into Fleming's meteorological fiction, became an advocate for trusting pilot observation over weather forecasts. "The sky doesn't lie," Mitusch argued in post-mission debriefings. "Reports can be wrong, but the weather is what it is. If we see clouds, there are clouds, regardless of what the forecast says." His navigator, Weber, took a different lesson from their experience. "The problem wasn't the forecast," he insisted. "The problem was that we planned a mission that depended on perfect weather, and then proceeded when the weather wasn't perfect. We should have had contingency plans for poor visibility, not just assumptions about clear skies." Both men were right, and both were wrong. The forecast had indeed been incorrect, but military operations couldn't be cancelled every time weather conditions were less than optimal. War doesn't wait for perfect atmospheric conditions, and the side that insisted on ideal weather would never fight at all. The real lesson of Fleming's mistake was more subtle: that information is only as reliable as the systems that produce it, and that those systems are always vulnerable to human error, technological failure, and the fundamental unpredictability of complex systems like global weather patterns. Fleming himself discovered his error 3 days later, when updated observations from European weather stations revealed the actual atmospheric conditions that had existed over southeastern England on September 15th. He found his miscalculation by working backward from the reported weather, checking his arithmetic, and realizing that he had misread the pressure gradient that had been the foundation for his entire forecast. His first reaction was professional embarrassment. Weather forecasting was a precision discipline, and accuracy was the measure of competence. A 3 millibar error was significant enough to affect operational planning, large enough to call his professional judgment into question. His second reaction was personal horror. Fleming understood enough about military operations to know that weather forecasts influenced tactical decisions, but he had no idea that his specific error had contributed to the failure of the largest air raid in history. He knew that his mistake had caused problems for someone, somewhere, but he couldn't know the full scope of what his miscalculation had prevented. Fleming spent the remainder of the war working with obsessive precision, checking and rechecking his calculations, verifying his observations against multiple sources, creating forecasts that were models of meteorological accuracy. His error rate dropped to nearly 0, and his reports became known throughout the Weather Intelligence Network for their reliability and precision. But he never forgot that his most important contribution to the war effort had been a mistake. The forecast that had helped save London from destruction had been wrong in every technical sense, while being absolutely right in every human sense. Years later, when the full story of September 15th became public knowledge, Fleming received letters from Londoners who had lived through the Blitz, thanking him for an error that he had tried to atone for through 4 years of flawless weather forecasting. The letters confused him. How do you accept gratitude for a mistake? But they also helped him understand that competence and consequence don't always align in the ways that professional training suggests they should. Fleming kept one letter until his death in 1978. It was from a woman named Margaret Thornton, who had been working as a nurse in a London hospital on September 15, 1940. She had been treating wounded civilians from earlier bombing raids when the air raid sirens sounded, warning of the massive German attack that never materialized with the devastating precision that German planners had intended. "I don't know if you meant to save my hospital," Margaret wrote, "but your wrong weather forecast scattered the German bombers enough that they missed us entirely. We were able to keep treating patients instead of becoming patients ourselves. I thought you should know that being wrong sometimes means being exactly right." Fleming never responded to Margaret's letter, but he kept it in his desk drawer, pulling it out whenever he felt overwhelmed by the responsibility of providing accurate forecasts for military operations. The letter reminded him that weather forecasting wasn't just about atmospheric pressure and wind patterns, it was about human lives, individual stories, personal moments that were shaped by information that traveled from instruments to decisions to consequences in ways that meteorologists rarely considered. The broader implications of Fleming's mistake extended far beyond the immediate military consequences. September 15, 1940, became known as Battle of Britain Day, the turning point when German air power was decisively defeated and Operation Sea Lion was effectively cancelled. The failure of the massive air raid convinced German planners that Britain could not be conquered through air power alone, and that invasion would require resources that Germany could not spare from other fronts. Fleming's meteorological error had strategic consequences that reached into the fundamental structure of the war. Britain survived as a base for Allied operations, eventually hosting the invasion forces that landed in Normandy and began the liberation of Western Europe. The government that Fleming's mistake had helped preserve became the nucleus of the coalition that would ultimately defeat Nazi Germany. But these grand historical consequences grew from a moment of individual human error. A tired meteorologist misreading an instrument in a remote weather station. The connection between Fleming's 3 millibar mistake and the eventual Allied victory was real but invisible, traceable through chains of cause and effect that no one could have predicted, and few people ever fully understood. The German pilots who had flown through Fleming's meteorological fiction carried their own stories forward into the changing dynamics of the war. Some became advocates for improved weather intelligence, arguing that better forecasting could prevent the kind of confusion that had destroyed the September 15th operation. Others became skeptics of intelligence-based planning, preferring tactical flexibility over strategic precision. Hauptmann Mitosch survived the war and became a commercial airline pilot, flying passenger routes across Europe in aircraft that were equipped with weather radar, instrument landing systems, and communication networks that made the kind of atmospheric confusion he had experienced over London virtually impossible. But he never forgot the lesson of September 15th, that weather could be both ally and enemy, that forecasts could be both salvation and trap, and that the sky always had the final word in any argument between human plans and atmospheric reality. His navigator, Weber, became a meteorologist after the war, working for the German Weather Service and contributing to the development of the modern forecasting systems that would make Fleming's kind of error increasingly rare. Weber understood that accuracy was important, but he also understood that no forecast could be perfect, and that military planners needed to account for uncertainty as much as they accounted for predicted conditions. The weather station in Newfoundland where Fleming had made his crucial mistake was expanded and modernized during the war, becoming a key node in the Allied weather intelligence network. The Quonset hut where Fleming had misread the pressure gradient was replaced by permanent buildings, sophisticated instruments, and communication systems that linked North American observations to European operational planning in real time. But the new systems, for all their technological sophistication, remained vulnerable to the same human errors that had characterized Fleming's work. Instruments could malfunction, operators could misread displays, and atmospheric phenomena could behave in ways that defied prediction. The quest for perfect weather forecasting remained elusive, limited by the fundamental unpredictability of complex systems and the human element that could never be entirely eliminated from the observation and interpretation process. Fleming's story became a case study in meteorological training programs, used to illustrate both the importance of accuracy and the inevitability of error in weather forecasting. Students learned to double-check their calculations, verify their observations, and understand the potential consequences of their work. But they also learned that mistakes were part of the human condition, and that the goal was not to eliminate error entirely, but to minimize its impact and maximize the learning that could come from inevitable failures. The case study always ended with the same question. If you knew that your weather forecast would influence life and death decisions, would you be more careful or more paralyzed? If you understood that your mistake could save lives or cost lives, would you trust your instruments more or trust them less? The questions had no clear answers, which was perhaps the most important lesson of all. Weather forecasting, like all human endeavors that dealt with complex systems and uncertain information, required a balance between confidence and humility, between precision and adaptability, between following procedures and trusting intuition. Fleming's 3 millibar error had demonstrated that this balance was always precarious, always subject to the kind of human mistakes that could have consequences far beyond their apparent significance. But it had also demonstrated that mistakes, when they happened in the right place at the right time, could be gifts that no amount of competence could provide. In the end, the weather report that saved London was wrong about everything except what mattered most. It was wrong about pressure, wrong about wind, wrong about visibility, and wrong about cloud cover. But it was right about creating the conditions that would preserve a city, protect a government, and maintain the foundation for eventual victory against forces that had seemed unstoppable. Fleming's mistake became a reminder that the most important predictions aren't always the most accurate ones, and that being wrong about the weather can sometimes be the most right thing of all. In war, information is power, but sometimes misinformation is salvation. And sometimes the forecast that fails is the forecast that saves everything. If stories like this make you think about the hidden connections between individual actions and historical outcomes, about the way small errors can have large consequences, about the meteorological mysteries that shape human destiny, then perhaps you understand why some mistakes are worth remembering, why some forecasts are worth preserving even when they're wrong, and why the most important weather reports are sometimes the ones that never match the sky.